Welcome back to our series on Bach's Orgelbüchlein. Today we're looking at one of the Christmas chorales, Jesu, meine Freude, Jesus, my joy. So the first question is, where is all that joy? Well, of course, that isn't any old kind of joy. That is Lutheran joy. This, and I speak as a paid-up Lutheran, this is the sound of Lutherans having a good time. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be so flippant. Joy shouldn't be confused with having fun. This hymn, incidentally, is still in the German hymn book, although it's been moved now from the Christmas section to a theme section on being sustained in God's love. But the hymn isn't as well known in other countries. So I thought it might be useful to look at another hymn, which in German makes reference to Jesu, meine Freude, and which is well known in other countries, because we can draw some parallels from it. So this hymn is the German hymn Schmücke dich, o liebe Seele, which is in verse 5, I think it speaks of Jesu, meine Lebenssonne, Jesu, meine Freude und Wonne. That hymn is translated into English as "Deck thyself, my soul, with gladness, leave the gloomy haunts of sadness, come into the daylight's splendor, there with joy thy praises render," and so on. In Norwegian it's translated also as Jesus livet sol og glede, again that word glede meaning joy. And yet the hymn has got anything but a party atmosphere. Now I'm referring to this hymn not because it's directly relevant to the chorale prelude, but because it is the closest parallel that you're likely to know if you're not coming to it from a German background. Interestingly, both German originals, these two hymns, both have a sprinkling of achs, ach being an expression of sorrow, sighing. A poem by the Welsh poet R. Williams Parry in his album, his collection entitled Yr Haf a Cherddi Eraill, speaks in these terms. Mae hiraeth yn y môr ar mynydd maith, mae hiraeth mewn distawrydd ac mewn can, mewn murmur dyfroedd a dragywydd daith, yn oriau'r machlid ac yn fflamau'r tân. It's a very beautiful poem in which he lists all these wonderful things in life. He talks about the sea and the mountains and quietness and singing, the sound of flowing water and the beauty of the sunset, and says that all these emotions or all these things ultimately evoke an emotion of existential longing. This hiraeth, a word for which there's no obvious translation. So these deepest emotions are complex and multidimensional, and they may not look superficially like joy or like fun. But to return for a moment to Lutherans and Christmas, I think the most wonderful Christmas hymn in any language at all, actually, is the Norwegian hymn Mitt hjerte alltid vanker, which speaks of one's thoughts constantly returning to the birthplace of Jesus, to the crib and the stable, and that this is my heart's castle of delight, mitt hjertes frydeslott, and that der min lengsel hjemme, there my longing is at home, though that is the home of my longing, rather. And that word longing or yearning, that is rather like the Welsh poem and the hiraeth, which refers to the joys of nature, or the wonderful things in nature, as a form of longing. To come to think of it, there is also an uk in verse 7 of that particular hymn. I'll put a link to the Norwegian hymn there in the comments underneath, and I do urge you, if you have a moment, to listen to it, simply because it's the most glorious hymn ever. But again, its approach to joy, to the joy of Christmas, is anything other than jollity. So that was really a very long rant about Freude, about joy, and what it means and doesn't mean. It's perhaps no coincidence that the German language is the one which invented the word Schadenfreude. But enough of that anyway. Let's go on to performance and how we're going to play this piece. This prelude is one of only 4 in the whole Orgelbüchlein that gets a tempo marking, and it's the only one that is marked largo. The other 3 with a tempo marking are all adagio. We talk a little bit in our episode about tempo, on what these words actually mean and what largo in particular means. If we were to put in order of tempo largo or adagio, and neither actually are necessarily terms which indicate tempo, they more indicate style, but if we were to try to put them in order, we would probably put adagio as slower than largo. But surprisingly, not all 18th century commentators are in agreement about that, and there are 1 or 2 that mark largo as a slower speed than adagio. Why is that? And what does it tell us about how to play this piece? Curiously, Bach's cousin, J.G. Walther, wrote a very good lexicon on music, and in that book he tries to define, amongst other things, define largo and what it means. And he uses this curious term, gleichsam erweiternd, kind of broadened out. Now think about that for a moment. If you're writing a professional lexicon for publication and you define something as, well, it's kind of like, that really means that you're trying to nail jelly to a wall. He's struggling to define what largo means. Another author, another writer of a lexicon, J.J. Krantz, the flautist, also in the 18th century, he writes what he terms an attempt at a guide for performance. He also has a go at defining largo, and his definition, in one sense, is even more surprising. He defines it as heavy. What on earth does he mean by that? And if we start to think about it, I think that Krantz here has a real insight. If you have a piece which is a very slow 4 in a bar, and you think of it as 4 in a bar, then you are going to get a flow of the kind which we talk about in Christum wird sollen loben schon, which is marked adagio. The following piece, actually, in the Orgelbüchlein, is marked adagio, and yet it has this sense of inevitability, this sense of flow and direction. If, rather than thinking 4 in a bar, you think 8 in a bar, you're not necessarily going to change the actual tempo, you're not going to change the speed of the semiquavers, and yet you're going to get less of a sense of flow. You're going to split up the concept, in your own mind at least, into 8 beats in a bar. And that is going to make it feel a little heavier. And I think that that ultimately is what Krantz is thinking of. In other words, when he says that largo is heavier, he's meaning that the beat is split up more. So rather than being a slow 4 in a bar, it becomes an 8 in a bar. And if we apply that to Jesu, meine, Freude, it starts to make sense. The harmonic rhythm is very dense, the figuration is quite dense, and there are certain places in which actually it makes absolute sense to have 8 in a bar. So if you want a concrete sign of that, we can look in bar 5, the left hand. The second beat is a D suspended over into a C. And that suspension is prepared obviously in the first beat, but it's prepared only at a semiquaver length. And Bach doesn't do that. Bach would always prepare a suspension with a quaver at least. And yet here he allows himself to prepare the D suspension with just a semiquaver because, I think, the beat is being split up into 8 in a bar. And so he can allow that. It's rather an unusual feature. And finally, registration. You hear this occasionally played rather loud, and it's sometimes suggested as being played rather loud, and I think that's an attempt to introduce a bit of that Freude into the proceedings, which, as we've argued already, is really not necessary. So I think that I would prefer to play it with a couple of quiet 8-foot stops, which is what I'm intending to do today, in quite a restrained manner. So I wish you the joy of Christmas, remembering that joy doesn't always look like jollity, and joy can be closely connected to longing.